Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the PSYCH Investor Summit, Data and Technology. I'm Victoria Decker, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all once again, or for the first time if you are new to this great event series, which really is one of the most engaging virtual gathering places for people invested and working in psychedelics here and now. So today we've gathered a group of some of the brightest minds and leading operators in the space together to discuss data and tech and their applications within psychedelics. It's a curious topic when you consider that psychedelic medicine and treatment is so focused on looking within, and that many of our hero psychedelics are products of the natural world. But it's become apparent that data and tech have a significant place here too. Today, we'll be exploring how technology can not only improve treatment and integration, but how it can help companies gather intelligence and build value for their shareholders. And for a second, while we're on the subject of intelligence, I am dying to shout out PSYCH's newly released, highly comprehensive third edition of the Psychedelics as Medicine report, which is available for download on psych.global right now. We are excited to have a contributor from the report here to open up our summit, Novamind Director and Chief Medical Officer, Reid Robison. If you are unfamiliar with them, Novamind is one of the leading innovators in the space today, tackling issues and creating solutions that are very 2021, including a clinical ketamine-assisted psychotherapy pilot for frontline healthcare workers. We're delighted to have Reid share his thoughts on the intersection of psychedelic medicine, data and tech, and how it can all be used to power treatment and support better patient outcomes, and of course, Novamind's place in it all. Reid, it is great to meet you, and I am very happy to give you the floor.
Thanks for having me. I'm Reid Robison, Chief Medical Officer at Novamind. It's an honor to be opening this exciting and timely event because it truly is an exciting time for the psychedelic industry as a whole. And as a psychiatrist, the future looks really bright for mental health care, and I can tell you why in today's talk. We'll be discussing some of the challenges that mental health faces as we head towards mainstream adoption of these new paradigm-shifting treatments like psychedelic medicine, and how data and tech can play a catalytic role. So first, I wanted to share a photo of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Homer Warner, one of my most memorable and influential mentors during my training, including my postdoc in medical informatics at the University of Utah, a program he founded. And he's considered one of the main founders of the field of medical informatics, and started that program, which was the first in the country, because he pioneered the use of computers in medicine. So at the beginning of Dr. Warner's career, I remember hearing the story of how he once stayed up all night analyzing just a single heartbeat, and with a slide rule. And then he ended up publishing a paper on analyzing cardiac waveforms with computers. And that's where it began. This was in the 1950s. So Intermountain Healthcare in Utah, and the hospital he worked in, Salt Lake City, was so impressed that they took a pretty smart gamble and bought him this room-sized computer in 1960. And you can see that in the photos. And with that, a new field was born, medical informatics. And by the early 70s, Dr. Warner and colleagues had taught computers how to analyze an EKG, interpret labs. And before I even was born, they were entering most prescription orders at that hospital into old school terminals. And I remember sitting with Dr. Warner one day in the med school library at the University of Utah. And ironically, we were sitting there right next to a big life-size statue of him, created not too many years earlier. And in the statue, he was holding this handheld device. And I smiled because in real life right there, he was also holding a smartphone. I should say smartphone with air quotes, because I think it was like a BlackBerry 7000 series with a full color 240 pixel display and a whopping 16 megabytes of storage. And he was comparing it to that first giant computer he worked with in the 60s, and how the handheld device was now hundreds of times faster. And my mind was blown. He told me the most sophisticated healthcare measurement device ever created now is the one in my hand. And so we've come a long way since computers came into medicine. And it certainly feels to me that we're at the dawn of a new era in psychiatry. And as stakeholders in this field, we really do have this golden opportunity to make a sizable impact with all these data points and technological resources at our fingertips. So while it's an exciting time, we have our work cut out for us because there are some high-level system challenges in mental health, like high cost, insufficient insurance coverage, long waits, and the pandemic has only intensified this and really shined a magnifying glass on the need at a global scale. So there are high-level care challenges too, like lack of effective interventions in many conditions and treatments falling short for so many individuals, the need for culturally sensitive interventions, more preventive health and mental health initiatives. And there's also work to do on the cultural and social front with the lack of awareness and stigma. So where does Novamind fit into this landscape? So we are on a mission to bring innovative mental health treatments to market and expand access to those treatments for all people. We're operating a pretty unique and successful business model focused on growing our network of psychiatry clinics and our research organization that serves drug developers. We have special expertise in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and one of the biggest real-world ketamine data sets in existence. And we have deep expertise in clinical research, especially psychedelic medicine. And we're hosting clinical trials for companies like Merck, Bionomics, Karuna. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is a departure from the current way of delivering mental health. It requires special infrastructure that most practitioners just don't have. And when you add to that this explosion of new therapeutic candidates coming down the pipeline that require research sites with that expertise and team members with that special training, you've got a challenge up ahead. And our clinics deliver both the mainstream and the newer treatment modalities like ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And our research sites are strategically co-located with our clinics to both enable recruitment from clinics and present these studies as options to our clients. So the market need by the communities and the market as a whole has been extremely positive by those we serve. And you can see by the growth of both our clinic footprint in Utah and our forecasted clinic visits this year. We did over 20,000 client visits last year, and that's growing rapidly. We are rolling out the infrastructure needed to be able to deliver these new psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies as they become available, like with MDMA and psilocybin coming down the pipeline, to take better and better care of individuals in the areas we serve. And so to bring a successful psychedelic medicine into mainstream healthcare, the industry has some big challenges. We do. It's to establish the efficacy and safety across diverse populations, for example. But I've summed it up here in three big challenges that we're addressing at Novamind through data and technology. One is that with mental health concerns on the rise and with mainstream treatments falling short, there's a need to really establish efficacy and safety. I should point out that the arrival of ketamine actually is thanks to real world data. Back in 2011, I was tasked with setting up a psychiatric consult service at Utah's biggest hospital, Intermountain Medical Center. And I started the day usually in the ER, seeing anyone with mental health concerns. And I'd make my way up to the ICUs, the medical floors, neurology. And sometimes, I'll be honest, I felt a little powerless with our available treatments when they didn't work. And interestingly, based on some real world data observations and clients coming out of anesthesia by some astute researchers out there, ketamine was seen to bring about some improvements in mood and was being evaluated as a new novel mechanism and a new much needed more rapid antidepressant. So I asked my colleagues what they thought of this crazy idea. What if I were to give ketamine to our shared client? And would they support me in that? And their answer kind of surprised me. They said, of course, let's do it right now. They had no problem with that. There was the infrastructure in that setting for that. So we did over and over, and people got better and better. And remember, this was in the health system with that first computer, the first EHR, where Dr. Warner used data and technology to improve outcomes. And so it's been one of the core values in that culture since. So I got a grant from Intermountains Foundation to study ketamine back then, 10 years ago. We set up protocols to give it on a regular basis, or a course of it, to individuals who need it. And so in psychedelic medicine in particular, this renaissance of research has produced so much strong evidence that, the train has left the station. It can't be stopped now, in my opinion, but now it's time to figure out specific ways of delivering these medicines, plus therapy, for different different conditions, different groups of people. Which brings us to the next point, is the need for best practices and treatment guidelines. There has been a lot of research that's been done already, and the evidence-based mental health care is becoming increasingly a priority for us all, and we really do need to go for the gold, in my opinion, which is full recovery, mental wellness, not just symptom management. And MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, to give an example, is poised to become not only the first FDA-approved medicine plus therapy intervention, but if approved by the FDA, it'll also be the first curative treatment we have in psychiatry, because, if you look at the phase 2 and phase 3 data that's come out so far from MAPS, nearly 70% of individuals with serious PTSD no longer even meet criteria for the condition 6 months later, without having to rely on a daily pill. And that sounds like progress to me. So mental health conditions need to be detected early, treated effectively, and yet this is still not the norm. In fact, in clinic, I can't even count the number of times I've received a denial, shockingly, from like an insurance company saying, your client is not sick enough, or their depression score not high enough, their BMI isn't low enough to justify an inpatient stay for eating disorders. But could you imagine if an insurance company said that to an oncologist? Sorry, their cancer isn't advanced enough, so we won't approve treatment. Which highlights the next challenge, opening up access to those who need it. The reimbursement and coverage policies need to reflect this need for individualized care, while still maintaining, flexibility to respond to consumer needs and test promising new treatment modalities. As an example, we've always given ketamine therapy, but in our clinics. But when Spravato was FDA approved in 2019, we made the decision to dedicate the resources, build the infrastructure, and offer it. So over now 4,500 plus doses later, I can tell you from our data, and show you in one of these slides, that there is statistically significant improvement in depression when looking at how it's been for our clients, with a very positive safety profile. So treatment costs are relevant to the discussion, but need to be taken in the context of the whole system, the total burden of disease, rather than restricting costs to particular cost centers. And more on that in future slides. So here's a soapbox I like to get on. Traditional physical health has measurements, like when they check your blood pressure and weight and vital signs every time you walk into a clinic of nearly any specialty, even if your visit has nothing to do with blood pressure. And so why doesn't behavioral health have that? I remember my postdoc mentor, Dr. Homer Warner, one of the founders of biomedical informatics. Remember how he invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in a room-sized computer at a hospital to teach it to measure basic parameters of the heart? Well, it's time to do that for psychiatry. And in some ways, in mental health, we're stuck in like the Sigmund Freud era, using just our questions and our appraisal of those answers from the client to do our assessments. And sure, having done this for over a decade, I can pick up a lot of things, but come on. Every other specialty has specific things they measure for specific conditions. You show up in a clinic with chest pain, and even though there are questions about it and you have your subjective answers about it, you also get an EKG and you get lab tests. So this is measurement-based care I'm describing, which is the process of using outcome measurements to guide treatment decisions. And it's like measuring these vital signs or blood pressure when treating hypertension or blood glucose for diabetes. And as clinicians, we need data at point of care. As stakeholders, we all need that data. We need it where decisions are made. And psychiatry especially needs all the objective data we can get. So for us at Novamind, measurement-based care is a process, not just a project. Excuse me. And technology is what enables this. So just to cite one example, there was a randomized controlled trial done with blinded raters that found that almost 75% of patients with depression who got measurement-based care experienced remission for their depression. Excuse me, compared to under 30% in the placebo group. So if you don't measure, you're just shooting in the dark. So we've rolled this out in every clinic where each client gets depression and anxiety questionnaires, for example. And they can complete these on their smartphones or on a tablet. When they get in the office, they can complete them from out of the office. Excuse me. And so moving on, here's an example of measurement-based care in action. So prior to COVID-19, healthcare workers were already at a significant risk of burnout and mental health conditions. And the pandemic just amplified this burden of an already demanding profession with things like social isolation, stress, extreme workload. There was this big Medscape survey that showed that, they asked over 7,500 docs and found out that 64% of them were experiencing intense burnout, while 46% reported feeling isolated and lonely. So the need for something like this is now. We couldn't wait months or years for a new drug or a traditional way of painstakingly testing, iterating on little bits of treatment modalities in the old way. But thankfully, we have this new world of real world data and measurement-based care to help inform programs and pilots like this. So we created a group-based protocol that we've called Frontline CAP, which consists of weekly sessions for 6 weeks. Lets these individuals process trauma with peers. And it includes 3 ketamine dosing sessions. And the group setting not only helps build community, reduce isolation, help you not feel so alone in it, but it also brings cost savings as an added benefit by doing this group model. So in a pilot like this, and in general, we assess multiple measures of mental health and wellness at baseline, even like a burnout inventory. And in real time, we track how people did. So we would know what's happening and we could individualize the approach, predict response. And we know from the psilocybin literature and from our ketamine data that individuals who have a high mystical experience score, reflective of a complete mystical experience, are more likely to have lasting changes. So we measured it right after each dosing session, and we can titrate dose accordingly. And so this is data on the graph from the first cohort we did in Utah. And the protocol, this whole idea came from a friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Shannon at the Wholeness Center in Colorado. And he was running another cohort in parallel too, as we've partnered on bringing this pilot to the world. So to help people we serve, we really need to understand what happens, why it happens, and how to improve it. But there's this gap between what's supposed to happen in healthcare and what really happens. And clinical trials tell us what's supposed to happen, but they're not the real world. Having done well over 250 clinical trials, I can tell you with confidence that there are very strict inclusion-exclusion criteria for a good reason to test these therapies in rigorous conditions, controlled conditions. But when treatments make it to clinics, there are countless new variables that are thrown in the mix. And it's this real-world data from the clinic that tells us what actually happened. And it's what actually happened that really matters. So here's an example of how we're using clinical data to fill this this clinical knowledge gap by looking at our Spravato or S-ketamine data as an example. So current treatment strategies for treatment-resistant depression consists of like switching antidepressants, combining them, adding other meds. But not only do these leave a high percentage of people still suffering with serious depressive symptoms, but many of these strategies come with unwanted side effects. And add to that most antidepressants take several weeks or more to kick in, and the risk of suicidality with severe treatment-resistant depression. And we literally have a crisis situation in our mental health system. So when Spravato came out in 2019, after getting FDA approval, we made the decision to offer it as a treatment option at all our clinics. And this approval was exciting to me for a number of reasons, because it was the first rapid antidepressant approved by the FDA and the first psychedelic type medicine approved for any psychiatric condition. The cost was high, and it did get criticism for that by a number of individuals, groups initially, but FDA approval meant that we could leverage clients' insurance, something they've been asking for years, but could rarely do with the regular ketamine as it's given off-label, because ketamine was first FDA approved in anesthesia and now is generic. So there, until now, to my knowledge, has been no real-world or long-term data for patients with TRD receiving S-ketamine. And like I pointed out in the last slide, it's what happens in the real world that really matters. So we did a retrospective study of our data. We obtained IRB approval from the University of Utah Ethics Board. We extracted a de-identified cohort of patients, of patient data with TRD and other conditions, although they all had TRD in order to receive S-ketamine therapy. And we looked at a time window, July 2019 to June 2020, as an initial first pass. And I'm showing just a couple figures representative of that data. We also looked at baseline characteristics, like the population with TRD also had a number of other mental health conditions on average, and physical health conditions, and we're often on multiple meds. So we did observe statistical significant and clinically meaningful improvements in depression symptoms as measured by the PHQ-9 depression instrument. And I was also really encouraged to see that there weren't any significant tolerability issues. And we also did an analysis that I'll talk about in a minute about the cost burden, and which was actually more minimal for patients themselves than we would have thought. So by leveraging patient assistance programs, et cetera. And so look at the lives saved, the reductions in the burden of severe depression that comes along with this therapy. So to leverage both our growing repository of real-world psychedelic medicine data and our research infrastructure, we created a multi-clinic prospective registry of ketamine data. So clinical registries, including like patient and clinic ones, product registries, claims, databases, they provide a rich source of real-world data. They're also critical tools for turning this real-world data into real-world evidence, and are often used to support post-marketing surveillance by drug companies as mandated by the FDA, and often called phase 4 studies or pharmacovigilance. But this ketamine registry allows us to establish best practices, demonstrate the safety and efficacy, like on this figure on the left showing what happened with the PHQ-9 score before treatment and after, and same with the suicidal ideation question on that scale that's shown in the other graph. And this also lets us start to publish safety and efficacy data and make meaningful contributions to the evidence base and improve how psychedelic medicine is delivered. Because sharing insights from clinically rich data sources is one of the key ways to advance and improve health outcomes for all. And so the last main point I wanted to make is on accessibility and how we can leverage data and technology to help expand access to quality mental health care, including psychedelic assisted psychotherapies. So depression and anxiety are estimated to cost our global economy like $1 trillion a year in lost productivity alone. And this doesn't even account for rates of cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease that are double in adults with serious mental health conditions. But it isn't all doom and gloom. The World Health Organization in a study also found that for every $1 spent treating common mental health concerns, there's a return of $4 in improved health and productivity. Another study showed that about 80% of employees treated for depression reported improved performance in work. Other studies cut absenteeism in half in workers. And so let's talk about the Spravato data that we were just looking at a couple slides ago as an example of how technology and data can help open up access. So there's a reason we were the first to give esketamine in Utah and have given it so many times since, because complex infrastructure is needed. And we've put a big focus on that. It's not just the in-office dosing and mandatory 2-hour monitoring period, but it's also that every provider, every clinic, every pharmacy, every patient needs to be registered in what's called a REM system, risk evaluation management system. And you can imagine that the Schedule I psychedelic medicines coming down the pipeline are only going to get even trickier and more complicated to deliver. So thankfully, from giving these 4,500 doses of Spravato in our clinic, we've gotten really good at prior authorizations. We've gotten really good from TMS work and in general for helping over 20,000 client visits last year. And so through these lessons learned, we've built this infrastructure and iterated a lot on how we approach the process to land on this efficient tech-enabled process to get prior authorizations done as efficiently as possible, because in treatment-resistant depression, time is of the essence. You want to avoid any unnecessary delays you can. So with esketamine as an example, this real-world data exploration that we recently did revealed some interesting insights, showing how leveraging this data can even help support decisions at an insurance provider level. Like all of those doses were given using insurance of some kind. 15% of people had their care entirely covered by commercial insurance. The average payment per visit was $215, but most of this cost was paid by patients' primary insurance, and patients' out-of-pocket payments were on average $37. And so compare that to the cash cost of cash pay ketamine at clinics across the country, which can range from $250 to $1,000 a treatment. And so you can see how we're just scratching the surface of what can be done with data to drive forward psychedelic medicine. And other initiatives to touch on a few that we've implemented to expand access are things like a secure patient portal accessible via web or smartphone for scheduling, communicating with your provider.